The morning sun cast long shadows across Highway 87 as Marcus Rodriguez revved his Harley-Davidson, the engine's rumble echoing through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. At 28, Marcus lived for these weekend rides through the countryside, where the open road offered him an escape from his job at the auto repair shop and the mounting bills that seemed to follow him everywhere. Marcus had saved for 3 years to buy the motorcycle, a gleaming black and chrome beast that represented freedom to him. Every Saturday morning he would take the same route out of town, past the old farmhouses and rolling hills that reminded him why he loved living in this small community. The bike was his pride and joy, meticulously maintained and polished until it sparkled in the sunlight. On this particular Saturday, Marcus was running late. His alarm hadn't gone off and he'd rushed through his morning routine, skipping breakfast and barely grabbing his helmet before heading out. The familiar weight of financial stress sat heavy on his shoulders as he thought about the overdue rent notice sitting on his kitchen table and the phone, calls from creditors he'd been avoiding as he approached the intersection of Highway 87 and Maple Street. Marcus noticed the traffic light ahead. It had been green for what seemed like a long time, and he knew it would change soon. He glanced at his speedometer and realized he was going faster than usual, his mind distracted by his financial worries and his eagerness to reach the open highway where he could truly let loose. The light turned yellow just as Marcus entered the intersection. In that split second, he faced a decision that would change everything. He could brake hard and risk losing control of the heavy motorcycle, or he could accelerate and try to make it through before the light turned red. His inexperience with high-pressure situations on the bike made the choice for him as he instinctively twisted the throttle. What Marcus didn't see was the elderly man crossing the street in the crosswalk on the far side of the intersection. Harold Patterson, 73 years old, was making his weekly trip to the pharmacy to pick up his heart medication. Harold moved slowly, his arthritis making each step deliberate and careful. He had been crossing at this same intersection for over 40 years, ever since he and his wife had moved to Cedar Falls after his retirement from the military. Harold was a creature of habit. Every Saturday morning at exactly 9:30, he would leave his small apartment above the bakery and walk the 6 blocks to Peterson's pharmacy. The pharmacist, Mrs. Chen, always had his prescription ready, along with a friendly smile and a few minutes of conversation about the weather or the local high school football team. It was one of the highlights of Harold's week, one of the few times he left his apartment for something other than groceries or doctor appointments. The old veteran had served 3 tours in Vietnam, earning a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star for his service. The medal sat in a dusty box in his closet, rarely looked at but never forgotten. Harold rarely spoke about his time in the war, even to his son David, who had followed in his father's footsteps by joining the army. The memories were too painful, too complicated, and Harold had learned long ago that most people didn't really want to hear the truth about what war was like. As Harold stepped into the crosswalk, he heard the familiar rumble of a motorcycle approaching. In his younger days, Harold had owned a bike himself, a smaller Honda that he'd used to commute to his job at the post office. He'd always been careful around motorcycles, knowing how difficult they could be to see and how vulnerable their riders were. But his hearing wasn't what it used to be, and his depth perception had been affected by the cataract surgery he'd had the previous year. Marcus saw the elderly man just as he entered the intersection at full speed. Time seemed to slow down as his brain processed what was happening. The old man was directly in his path, moving slowly across the crosswalk with the measured steps of someone who had learned to be careful with age. Marcus grabbed both brakes as hard as he could, feeling the rear wheel lock up and the bike begin to slide sideways on the asphalt. The collision was inevitable. Despite Marcus's desperate attempt to stop, the motorcycle struck Harold on his left side, sending the elderly man tumbling across the pavement like a rag doll. The impact threw Marcus from his bike and he slid 20 feet across the intersection, his leather jacket and jeans shredding against the rough asphalt. The motorcycle continued its violent dance, sparks flying as it scraped along the road before finally coming to rest against a traffic signpost. For a moment, the intersection was eerily quiet except for the hissing of the damaged motorcycle and the distant sound of car alarms triggered by the crash. Then reality crashed back in as witnesses began shouting and running toward the 2 motionless figures lying in the street. Someone was already dialing 911, their voice shaking as they tried to describe the scene to the emergency dispatcher. Marcus was the first to move, groaning as he tried to push himself up from the pavement. His left shoulder was on fire with pain, and he could feel blood running down his face from where his helmet had scraped against the road. But his first thought wasn't for his own injuries. As his vision cleared, he saw the elderly man lying motionless 30 feet away, and his heart sank into his stomach. Harold lay on his side, his weekly pharmacy trip forgotten. His body twisted at an angle that made Marcus feel sick to look at. Blood was pooling beneath the old man's head, and his chest was barely moving. Marcus tried to stand but fell back down, his injured leg unable to support his weight. All he could do was watch in horror as Good Samaritans rushed to help the man he had struck. The wail of sirens filled the air as emergency vehicles raced toward the scene. Marcus closed his eyes and tried to block out the sounds of chaos around him, but he couldn't escape the image of the elderly man lying broken in the street. In that moment, Marcus knew that his life had just taken a turn from which there might be no return. The emergency room at Cedar Falls General Hospital buzzed with controlled chaos as the trauma team worked on Harold Patterson. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the head of emergency medicine, barked orders to her staff as they worked to stabilize the elderly man who had been brought in from the motorcycle accident. Harold's injuries were severe but not immediately life-threatening, though the doctor was concerned about internal bleeding and possible brain trauma from the impact. Marcus sat in a wheelchair in the adjacent treatment room, his own injuries being tended to by a nurse named Jennifer. His left shoulder was dislocated, requiring a painful procedure to put it back in place. Road rash covered the left side of his body where he had slid across the asphalt, and he would need several stitches for the cut above his left eye. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the crushing weight of guilt that pressed down on his chest like a lead blanket. Officer Tom Bradley of the Cedar Falls Police Department stood nearby, taking notes in a small notepad as he waited for Marcus to be cleared by the medical staff. The accident investigation would need to wait until both men were stable, but preliminary witness statements suggested that Marcus had run a red light. The officer had worked dozens of traffic accidents in his 15 years on the force, but he never got used to seeing the aftermath of split-second decisions that changed lives forever. In the waiting room, Harold's neighbor Mrs. Angela Foster paced nervously as she waited for news about her friend's condition. She had been the one to call Harold's emergency contact information when the hospital staff had asked if anyone knew how to reach his family. The phone number in Harold's wallet was for his son David, but Mrs. Foster knew that David was deployed overseas with the Army and wouldn't be easy to reach. Mrs. Foster had lived next door to Harold for over 20 years, and she had watched him slowly withdraw from the world after his wife Martha had passed away 5 years earlier. Harold had become increasingly isolated, rarely leaving his apartment except for essential errands like his weekly trip to the pharmacy. She had tried to include him in community activities and had invited him for dinner countless times, but Harold always politely declined, preferring the solitude of his small apartment. The elderly woman remembered when Harold and Martha had first moved to Cedar Falls. They had been a vibrant couple, active in the local VFW chapter, and regular volunteers at the community center. Harold had coached Little League Baseball for several years, and Martha had run a quilting circle that met every Tuesday evening at their home. But after Martha's death from cancer, Harold had seemed to lose his connection to the world around him. Dr. Mitchell emerged from Harold's treatment room and approached Mrs. Foster with a serious expression. The elderly man had suffered 3 broken ribs, a fractured left arm, and a severe concussion. The brain scan had shown some swelling, which was concerning but not immediately dangerous. Harold would need to remain in the hospital for several days for observation, and his recovery would likely take months. The doctor explained that Harold was conscious but confused, a common symptom of head trauma that could improve with time. Meanwhile, Marcus was being questioned by Officer Bradley about the circumstances of the accident. Marcus explained that he had been distracted by personal problems and had been going faster than usual when he approached the intersection. He admitted that the light had been yellow when he entered the intersection, but he claimed that he hadn't seen the elderly pedestrian until it was too late to avoid the collision. The police officer's investigation would include examining the traffic light timing, reviewing any available security camera footage, and interviewing all witnesses to determine if criminal charges should be filed. Marcus could face charges ranging from careless driving to vehicular assault, depending on what the investigation revealed. The young man's lack of a previous driving record would work in his favor, But the severity of Harold's injuries meant that the district attorney's office would likely take a close look at the case, and as Marcus was discharged from the hospital with instructions to follow up with his family doctor, he asked Officer Bradley if he could see the man he had hit. The officer explained that this wouldn't be appropriate given the ongoing investigation, but he could see the pain and remorse in Marcus's eyes. Many drivers involved in serious accidents struggled with guilt and trauma, even when the accident wasn't entirely their fault. Marcus returned to his small apartment that evening, his motorcycle impounded as evidence and his body aching from his injuries. The silence of his apartment felt oppressive as he replayed the accident over and over in his mind. He kept seeing the elderly man's face in that split second before impact, the look of surprise and fear that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his life. The young man had never been in serious trouble before. He had grown up in Cedar Falls, graduated from the local high school, and had been working steadily since he was 18. His parents had raised him to take responsibility for his actions, and the weight of what he had done felt unbearable. He knew that he would have to face legal consequences for the accident, but the emotional toll was already threatening to overwhelm him. 3,000 miles away, at a forward operating base in Afghanistan, Master Sergeant David Patterson was finishing his evening briefing with his squad when his commanding officer approached with a message that would change everything. The Red Cross communication informed David that his father had been seriously injured in a traffic accident and was hospitalized in critical condition. The message was brief and lacked details, but it was enough to send David's world spinning. David had been deployed for 8 months on his third tour of duty, leading a specialized reconnaissance unit that conducted dangerous missions behind enemy lines. At 35, he was a career soldier who had dedicated his life to serving his country, following in the footsteps of his father who had served with distinction in Vietnam. David's unit respected him not just for his tactical skills, but for his calm leadership under pressure and his unwavering commitment to bringing every soldier home safely. The news of his father's accident hit David like a physical blow. Harold Patterson was the most important person in David's life, the man who had taught him about honor, duty, and sacrifice. Despite his father's reluctance to discuss his war experiences, David had grown up understanding that Harold was a hero who had served his country with distinction. The Purple Heart and Bronze Star in Harold's closet were testament to his father's courage and sacrifice. David's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, had served with David on 2 previous deployments and understood the close relationship between the sergeant and his father. Morrison immediately began the process of arranging emergency leave for David, knowing that family emergencies took priority over military operations. The paperwork would take time, but David could be on a transport plane home within 48 hours. As David packed his gear and prepared for the long journey home, he couldn't shake the feeling that his father's accident was somehow connected to something larger. Harold Patterson was a careful man who rarely took risks, and David found it hard to believe that his father had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The lack of details in the Red Cross message only added to David's anxiety as he prepared to face whatever waited for him back in Cedar Falls. Detective Laura Santos arrived at the Cedar Falls Police Department early Monday morning to find the motorcycle accident file waiting on her desk. As the department's lead traffic accident investigator, she had seen hundreds of similar cases, but something about this one had caught the attention of her supervisor. The victim was a decorated Vietnam veteran, and the preliminary witness statement suggested that the motorcycle rider might have been driving recklessly. Santos spread the case materials across her desk and began her methodical review of the evidence. The intersection where the accident occurred was controlled by a traffic signal that had been recently updated with digital timing systems. The light sequence was programmed to give pedestrians adequate time to cross, but several witnesses reported that the motorcycle had entered the intersection after the light had turned yellow, possibly even red. The security camera from Peterson's pharmacy across the street had captured the entire incident, though the angle wasn't perfect. Santos watched the footage repeatedly, timing the light sequence and measuring the motorcycle's speed as it approached the intersection. The video clearly showed Marcus Rodriguez entering the intersection on a yellow light, but the exact timing was close enough that it would require expert analysis to determine if he had legally entered or run a red light. Marcus's motorcycle had been towed to the police impound lot. where Santos conducted a thorough mechanical inspection. The bike's brakes were in good working order, and there was no evidence of mechanical failure that might have contributed to the accident. Skid marks at the scene showed that Marcus had applied the brakes hard in the final seconds before impact, but his speed had been too great to stop in time. The investigation took on added urgency when Santos learned more about Harold Patterson's background. The elderly veteran had served with the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam, earning his Purple Heart during the Tet Offensive in 1968, when shrapnel from a mortar round had nearly cost him his left leg. His Bronze Star had come later that same year, when he had risked his life to rescue 3 wounded soldiers from a burning helicopter. Harold Patterson was exactly the kind of citizen that Cedar Falls took pride in protecting. Santos interviewed Mrs. Foster again, this time learning more about Harold's routine and state of mind in the weeks leading up to the accident. The neighbor confirmed that Harold made the same trip to the pharmacy every Saturday morning at the same time, and that he was always careful when crossing streets. Harold's vision and hearing had declined with age, but he remained mentally sharp and aware of his surroundings. The detective also spoke with Mrs. Chen at Peterson's pharmacy, who had been expecting Harold that morning and had grown concerned when he failed to appear for his usual pickup. Mrs. Chen described Harold as a quiet, polite man who never caused any trouble and always thanked her for her help. The pharmacist had been devastated to learn about the accident and had sent flowers to the hospital. Marcus Rodriguez proved to be a more complex figure than Santos had initially expected. The young man had no prior traffic violations and no criminal record of any kind. His employer at Morrison's Auto Repair described him as a reliable worker who was always on time and took pride in his work. However, several co-workers mentioned that Marcus had seemed stressed and distracted in recent weeks, apparently struggling with financial problems. Santos discovered that Marcus was 3 months behind on his rent and had received notice from his landlord threatening eviction. His credit cards were maxed out, and he had been working overtime whenever possible to try to catch up on his bills. The financial pressure might have explained why Marcus had been distracted while riding, but it didn't excuse running a red light and striking a pedestrian. The detectives' investigation also revealed that Marcus had only owned the motorcycle for 6 months and had limited experience riding in traffic. He had taken a basic motorcycle safety course but hadn't completed any advanced training. Several witnesses described his riding as aggressive and noted that he often seemed to be in a hurry when they had seen him around town. As Santos continued her investigation, she became aware that Harold Patterson's son was a decorated Army sergeant currently deployed in Afghanistan. David Patterson's military record was impressive, showing multiple combat deployments and numerous commendations for leadership and bravery. Santos realized that this case would likely attract media attention once David returned home, adding pressure to complete a thorough and fair investigation. The detective interviewed the 3 witnesses who had seen the accident occur. Maria Gonzalez, a teacher at the local elementary school, had been walking her dog when she saw the motorcycle speeding toward the intersection. She testified that the light had definitely turned yellow before Marcus entered the intersection, and she believed it might have been red. Her testimony would be crucial in determining whether criminal charges should be filed. Dr. Robert Kim, a local dentist who had been driving through the intersection in the opposite direction, corroborated Maria's account. He had stopped at the red light and watched in horror as the motorcycle struck Harold. Dr. Kim had immediately called 911 and had stayed at the scene to provide first aid until the paramedics arrived. His medical training had allowed him to stabilize Harold's condition and might have saved the elderly man's life. The 3rd witness, 16-year-old Tyler Mason, had been riding his bicycle on the sidewalk when the accident occurred. Tyler's account was slightly different from the other witnesses, suggesting that the light might still have been yellow when Marcus entered the intersection. However, Santos noted that Tyler had seemed nervous during the interview and might have been influenced by his sympathy for Marcus, who was closer to his own age. Santos also investigated Marcus's behavior after the accident. Several witnesses reported that the young man had seemed genuinely distraught and had repeatedly asked about Harold's condition. He had cooperated fully with the police investigation and had made no attempt to flee the scene or avoid responsibility. These factors would be considered when determining whether to file criminal charges. The medical reports from Cedar Falls General Hospital painted a grim picture of Harold's injuries. In addition to his broken bones and concussion, the elderly veteran was showing signs of post-traumatic stress that doctors believed might be related to his military service. The trauma of the accident appeared to have triggered memories from his time in Vietnam, causing Harold to experience flashbacks and nightmares that complicated his recovery. Dr. Mitchell informed Santos that Harold's prognosis was uncertain. While his physical injuries would heal with time, the psychological trauma might have lasting effects. The elderly man's age and overall health meant that his recovery would be slow and difficult, and there was a possibility that he might never fully regain his previous level of independence. As Santos prepared her final report, she weighed all the evidence carefully. Marcus Rodriguez had made a serious error in judgment that had resulted in severe injuries to an innocent man. Whether that error rose to the level of criminal negligence would be up to the district attorney to decide. The detective's job was to present the facts objectively and let the legal system determine the appropriate consequences. The case had already begun to generate buzz in the local community. Harold Patterson was well known and respected, despite his reclusive nature in recent years. Many residents remembered his service to the country and his contributions to the community in earlier decades. The fact that his son was currently serving overseas added an emotional dimension to the case that couldn't be ignored. Santos knew that her investigation would be scrutinized by both the media and the Patterson family when David returned from Afghanistan. She had conducted the investigation by the book, following every lead and examining every piece of evidence. Now it was time to turn the case over to the district attorney's office and let the legal process take its course. The C-130 transport plane touched down at Dover Air Force Base on Wednesday morning, carrying Master Sergeant David Patterson and dozens of other soldiers on emergency leave. David had spent the 36-hour journey from Afghanistan replaying every conversation he'd had with his father over the past year, searching for clues about Harold's state of mind and physical condition that might help him understand how the accident had happened. David's hands shook slightly as he called Mrs. Foster from the airport. The neighbor's voice broke with emotion as she described finding Harold unconscious in the hospital and the long hours she had spent by his bedside waiting for David to come home. She explained that Harold was conscious now but confused, sometimes forgetting where he was and occasionally calling out for his late wife Martha in his sleep. The 4-hour drive from Delaware to Cedar Falls gave David time to prepare himself for what he would find at the hospital. He had seen the aftermath of violence many times during his military career, but this was different. This was his father, the man who had raised him alone after his mother had died when David was 12. Harold Patterson had been both father and mother to David, teaching him how to throw a baseball, helping him with homework, and later supporting his decision to join the Army. Cedar Falls General Hospital felt sterile and unfamiliar as David made his way to the third-floor room where his father was recovering. Dr. Mitchell met him at the nurses' station and explained Harold's condition in clinical terms that somehow made the injuries seem both more real and more abstract. Brain swelling, fractured ribs, internal bleeding, psychological trauma, all medical terms that couldn't capture the full impact of what had happened to the man David loved most in the world. Harold was awake when David entered the room, but his eyes seemed to look through his son rather than at him. The elderly man's face was swollen and bruised, and his left arm was immobilized in a cast that extended from his shoulder to his fingertips. Machines beeped softly around the bed, monitoring vital signs and dispensing medication through an IV line that snaked into Harold's right arm. David pulled a chair close to his father's bedside and took Harold's uninjured hand in his own. The skin felt papery and cold, so different from the strong hands that had taught David how to tie knots, fix bicycles, and handle a rifle. Harold's eyes focused on David's face with effort, and for a moment the confusion cleared as recognition dawned. Harold's voice was weak and scratchy when he finally spoke, asking David why he wasn't in Afghanistan with his unit. The question revealed how disoriented Harold still was, as if the accident had happened yesterday instead of 4 days ago. David explained gently that he was on emergency leave, that he had come home because Harold was hurt, but his father seemed to have trouble processing the information. Over the next several hours, David pieced together what had happened from conversations with Dr. Mitchell, Mrs. Foster, and the hospital staff. He learned about Marcus Rodriguez, the young motorcycle rider who had struck his father, and about the police investigation that was still ongoing. The more David learned, the angrier he became at the senseless nature of the accident that had devastated his father's life. Mrs. Foster had brought Harold's personal effects from the scene of the accident, including the wallet that contained David's military contact information. The elderly woman explained how she had called the hospital when Harold failed to return from his pharmacy trip, how she had identified his body in the emergency room, and how she had held his hand during the first terrifying hours when doctors weren't sure if he would survive. David felt overwhelming guilt that he hadn't been there when his father needed him most. For the past 8 months, he'd been leading soldiers in combat operations thousands of miles away, while his father had been struggling with loneliness and isolation back home. David realized that he had been so focused on his military career and his duty to his soldiers that he had neglected his responsibility to the most important person in his life. The hospital social worker, Janet Morrison, met with David to discuss Harold's long-term care needs. The elderly man would require months of physical therapy to regain strength in his broken arm and to address the mobility issues caused by his other injuries. More concerning was the psychological trauma that seemed to have triggered memories from Harold's time in Vietnam. The accident had somehow unlocked decades of suppressed memories and emotions that Harold had worked hard to keep buried. David learned that his father had been experiencing nightmares and flashbacks that transported him back to the jungles of Southeast Asia. Harold sometimes believed he was still a young soldier fighting for his life, and he would call out warnings about incoming mortar rounds or enemy soldiers. The medical staff had consulted with a specialist in post-traumatic stress disorder, but treatment would be complicated by Harold's age and the severity of his recent trauma. On Thursday morning, David met with Detective Santos to learn more about the investigation into the accident. The detective was professional and sympathetic, but she made it clear that Marcus Rodriguez bore significant responsibility for what had happened. The evidence suggested that Marcus had been driving too fast and had entered the intersection illegally, directly causing the collision that had nearly killed Harold. David listened carefully as Detective Santos explained the technical details of the investigation. The traffic camera footage, witness statements, and physical evidence all pointed to Marcus as the at-fault driver. The district attorney's office was considering charges ranging from careless driving to vehicular assault, depending on their assessment of Marcus's culpability and the severity of Harold's injuries. When David asked to see the security camera footage, Detective Santos hesitated but eventually agreed to show him the video in her office. Watching his father get struck by the motorcycle was one of the most difficult things David had ever experienced. He had seen men die in combat, had lost soldiers under his command, but seeing his own father lying broken in the street triggered a rage that threatened to consume him. David's military training had taught him to channel anger into focused action, and he began to think about how he could use his position and connections to ensure that Marcus Rodriguez faced appropriate consequences for his actions. David had friends in law enforcement, fellow veterans in positions of authority, and a network of military contacts who might be able to apply pressure to the district attorney's office. The soldier in David understood the concept of proportional response and appropriate justice. Marcus Rodriguez had made a terrible mistake that had devastated an innocent man's life, and he needed to be held accountable for his actions. David wasn't interested in revenge, but he was determined to see that justice was served for his father. David also began researching Marcus Rodriguez, using his military intelligence training to gather information about the young man who had changed his family's life forever. What he discovered was a picture of someone struggling with financial problems and personal challenges, but also someone with no history of violence or reckless behavior. The complexity of Marcus's situation didn't excuse what he had done, but it made David's feelings about the case more complicated. As David sat by his father's bedside that evening, watching Harold sleep fitfully under the influence of pain medication, he made a decision about how he would handle the situation. He would use every resource at his disposal to ensure that Marcus Rodriguez faced appropriate legal consequences, but he would do it within the system and according to the law. David Patterson was a soldier who believed in justice, not vigilante revenge. Harold stirred in his sleep and mumbled something about incoming artillery. his mind still trapped in the jungles of Vietnam 50 years later. David squeezed his father's hand and whispered reassurances that the war was over, that he was safe, that his son was home and would protect him. But even as David spoke these words, he knew that his father's war might never truly be over, and that the accident had opened wounds that might never fully heal. The next morning, David would begin the process of seeking justice for his father, using all of his military training and connections to ensure that Marcus Rodriguez understood the full consequences of his actions. But tonight, he was simply a son watching over his wounded father, hoping that love and time might somehow heal the damage that had been done. David Patterson spent Friday morning making phone calls from the hospital waiting room, reaching out to contacts in the military and law enforcement communities who might be able to provide insight into the legal process surrounding his father's case. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, had given him unlimited leave time and had offered to provide character references for Harold if they might help with the prosecution of Marcus Rodriguez. The district attorney's office had scheduled a meeting with David for Monday morning to discuss the case and gather victim impact information that would be considered in determining charges against Marcus. David had prepared a detailed statement about his father's military service, his contributions to the community, and the devastating impact the accident had had on Harold's physical and mental health. As David researched the legal process, he learned that Marcus Rodriguez had retained a public defender named Jennifer Walsh, a young attorney who specialized in traffic cases and had a reputation for negotiating reduced charges for first-time offenders. The fact that Marcus couldn't afford private counsel suggested that his financial problems were even more severe than the police reports had indicated. David's investigation into Marcus's background had revealed a complex picture of a young man struggling with circumstances that many people would find overwhelming. Marcus worked 50-hour weeks at Morrison's Auto Repair, earning just above minimum wage while trying to support himself and pay off debts from a brief attempt at community college that had ended when he couldn't afford tuition. The motorcycle that had struck Harold represented Marcus's only significant asset, purchased with savings accumulated over 3 years of working double shifts and skipping meals. For Marcus, the bike had been both transportation and escape, a way to feel free despite the financial pressures that dominated every other aspect of his life. Now the motorcycle sat in a police impound lot, likely to be sold to pay for legal fees and potential restitution. On Saturday morning, David made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of waiting for the formal legal process to unfold, he decided to confront Marcus Rodriguez directly. David had learned that Marcus was staying with his aunt while his apartment lease was terminated due to his inability to pay rent. Armed with the address and driven by a need to look into the eyes of the man who had nearly killed his father, David drove across town to the modest neighborhood where Marcus was staying. Marcus answered the door himself when David knocked, his left arm still in a sling from his shoulder injury, and his face showing the healing road rash from the accident. The young man's eyes widened with recognition and fear when he saw David's military bearing and the angry expression on his face. Marcus had been expecting this confrontation since learning that Harold Patterson had a son in the Army. David introduced himself formally as Master Sergeant Patterson and requested permission to speak with Marcus privately. The young man's aunt, Rosa Martinez, recognized the military authority in David's voice and invited him into her small living room while she retreated to the kitchen to give them privacy. The tension in the room was palpable as the two men faced each other for the first time. Marcus spoke first, his voice shaking with emotion as he apologized for what had happened to Harold. The young man explained that he thought about the accident every waking moment, that he couldn't sleep without seeing Harold's face in that split second before impact. Marcus admitted that he had been distracted and driving too fast, and he accepted full responsibility for the collision that had changed both their lives forever. David listened to Marcus's apology without interruption, studying the young man's face for signs of deception or insincerity. What he saw instead was genuine remorse and a level of anguish that seemed to match his own. Marcus wasn't trying to make excuses or shift blame. He was simply a young man devastated by the consequences of a terrible mistake. When Marcus finished speaking, David described his father's condition in clinical detail. He explained Harold's military service, his Purple Heart and Bronze Star, and his decades of quiet contributions to the Cedar Falls community. David wanted Marcus to understand exactly who he had injured, to comprehend the full measure of the man whose life he had shattered with his carelessness. David also described the psychological trauma that had been triggered by the accident, how Harold was reliving his experiences in Vietnam and struggling with memories that had been buried for 50 years. The elderly veteran was fighting two wars simultaneously, one against his physical injuries and another against the demons from his past that the accident had unleashed. Marcus listened with tears streaming down his face as David explained how the accident had affected not just Harold, but the entire family. David had been forced to leave his soldiers in a combat zone, abandoning his duty to rush home to care for his wounded father. The ripple effects of Marcus's split-second decision had reached across the world to disrupt military operations and put other soldiers at risk. As David spoke, his anger began to transform into something more complex. He could see that Marcus was genuinely devastated by what had happened, that the young man was suffering almost as much as Harold was. This wasn't a callous criminal who had hurt someone without caring about the consequences. This was a young man whose life had been destroyed by a moment of poor judgment. Marcus asked about Harold's prognosis and whether there was anything he could do to help with medical expenses or care needs. The young man had no money to offer, but he was willing to work extra hours or donate time to help Harold in any way possible. Marcus's offer was both touching and heartbreaking, a gesture of goodwill from someone who had nothing left to give. David found himself sharing stories about his father's military service that he had never told anyone before. He described Harold's courage under fire, his dedication to his fellow soldiers, and the quiet dignity with which he had carried the burdens of war for over 50 years. As David spoke, he began to see Marcus not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a young man who needed to understand the true cost of his actions. The conversation lasted for over 2 hours, during which both men shared their perspectives on the accident and its aftermath. Marcus described the financial pressures that had been weighing on him, the stress that had contributed to his distracted state of mind on the morning of the accident. He didn't offer these as excuses, but rather as context to help David understand how the tragedy had unfolded. David learned that Marcus had grown up without a father, raised by his mother and aunt in a series of low-income neighborhoods where opportunities were limited and mistakes often had devastating consequences. The young man had been working since he was 16, trying to create a better life for himself through hard work and determination. The motorcycle accident had shattered those dreams just as surely as it had shattered Harold's bones. As the conversation drew to a close, David made a decision that would have surprised his fellow soldiers and family members. Instead of threatening Marcus with the full weight of military and legal pressure, David offered him something unexpected, a chance at redemption through service to Harold and other veterans in the community. David proposed that Marcus volunteer at the local VFW chapter, helping elderly veterans with transportation, yard work, and other daily tasks that had become difficult for them to manage alone. This wouldn't replace the legal consequences that Marcus would face, but it would give him an opportunity to channel his remorse into positive action that honored Harold's service and sacrifice. Marcus accepted the proposal immediately, recognizing it as more than he deserved but exactly what he needed to begin healing from the trauma of the accident. The young man understood that he would spend the rest of his life trying to make amends for what he had done, and David's offer gave him a constructive way to start that process. Before leaving, David extracted a promise from Marcus that he would attend every court hearing and cooperate fully with the legal process, regardless of how difficult it might be. David also insisted that Marcus complete defensive driving courses and motorcycle safety training to ensure that nothing like this would ever happen again. The young man agreed to all conditions without hesitation. As David drove back to the hospital, he reflected on the unexpected turn the confrontation had taken. His military training had prepared him to identify and defeat enemies, but Marcus Rodriguez wasn't really an enemy. He was a young man who had made a terrible mistake and would have to live with the consequences for the rest of his life. David realized that his father would approve of the approach he had taken with Marcus. Harold Patterson had always believed in second chances and redemption through service, values that had been shaped by his own experiences as a young soldier who had made mistakes and learned from them. The elderly veteran had never spoken much about the war, but he had always emphasized the importance of taking care of fellow veterans and giving back to the community. When David returned to Harold's hospital room, he found his father awake and more alert than he had been since the accident. The elderly man asking, and for the first time since coming home, David felt comfortable sharing details about what he had been doing. He described his meeting with Marcus, the young man's remorse, and the plan for community service theft. 6 months after the accident, the Cedar Falls courthouse was packed with community members, veterans, and media representatives who had come to witness the sentencing of Marcus Rodriguez. The young man had pleaded guilty to vehicular assault and reckless driving, accepting responsibility for his actions, while his public defender argued for leniency based on his clean record and genuine remorse. Judge Patricia Williams had reviewed all the evidence in the case, including victim impact statements from David Patterson and several members of the local VFW chapter. She had also considered the unusual recommendation from the district attorney's office, which had been influenced by David's request for a sentence that emphasized rehabilitation and community service over pure punishment. Marcus stood before the judge wearing his only suit, borrowed from his uncle for the occasion. His shoulder had healed completely, but he still carried visible scars from the road rash that served as daily reminders of the accident. Over the past 6 months, Marcus had completed defensive driving courses, motorcycle safety training, and over 300 hours of volunteer work at the VFW chapter and local nursing home. Harold Patterson sat in the front row of the courtroom, supported by a walker but determined to be present for Marcus's sentencing. The elderly veteran had made remarkable progress in his physical recovery, though he still struggled with occasional flashbacks and nightmares related to his Vietnam service. The trauma of the accident had forced Harold to confront memories he had suppressed for decades, but working with a VA counselor had helped him process those experiences in a healthier way. David Patterson sat beside his father, having extended his emergency leave to help Harold through his recovery and to see the legal case through to its conclusion. The Master Sergeant had received approval to transition to a stateside assignment so he could remain close to his father during the rehabilitation process. David's commanding officers had recognized that his family situation required his presence, and his exemplary service record had made the accommodation possible. In her remarks before sentencing, Judge Williams acknowledged the unusual circumstances of the case and the remarkable response from the Patterson family. She noted that Harold and David Patterson had chosen to focus on rehabilitation and community service rather than seeking maximum punishment for Marcus. Their approach had impressed the court and demonstrated the kind of leadership and compassion that military service was supposed to instill. The judge sentenced Marcus to 1 year in county jail with work release privileges, 5 years of probation, 1,000 hours of community service specifically focused on helping veterans, and restitution for Harold's medical expenses. The sentence was more lenient than it might have been in other circumstances, but it reflected the court's recognition that Marcus had already begun the process of making amends for his actions. Marcus would serve his jail time on weekends while continuing to work during the week at a new job that David had helped him find at a veteran-owned auto repair shop. The owner, Tom Mitchell, was a former Marine who believed in second chances and was willing to give Marcus an opportunity to rebuild his life while serving his sentence. The community service requirement would be fulfilled through continued work at the VFW chapter, where Marcus had become an invaluable volunteer who helped elderly veterans with transportation, home maintenance, and companionship. The young man had developed genuine relationships with many of the veterans he served, and several had written letters to the court supporting leniency in his sentencing. After the sentencing, Harold Patterson surprised everyone by asking to speak with Marcus privately. The two men had not seen each other since the accident, and their first meeting was emotional for both of them. Harold, leaning heavily on his walker, told Marcus that he forgave him for what had happened and that he was proud of the way the young man had responded to the tragedy. Marcus broke down in tears as he apologized again for the pain he had caused Harold and his family. The elderly veteran listened patiently and then shared something that surprised Marcus. Harold admitted that he too had made mistakes as a young man that had hurt other people. The difference was that Marcus had been given the opportunity to make amends, while Harold had carried the weight of his wartime experiences for 50 years without ever finding closure. Harold explained that watching Marcus work to redeem himself had actually helped Harold process his own guilt and trauma from Vietnam. Seeing the young man's genuine commitment to helping other veterans had reminded Harold of the importance of service and sacrifice, values that had been central to his own identity as a soldier, but had been buried under decades of survivors' guilt and isolation. The three men, Harold, David, and Marcus, left the courthouse together and drove to the Cedar Falls Veterans Memorial, where they had planned a small ceremony to honor the resolution of the case. Members of the VFW chapter had gathered to show their support for both Harold's recovery and Marcus's commitment to serving the veteran community. At the memorial, David read a statement that had been prepared by his father, who was still too emotional to speak publicly. Harold's statement acknowledged the pain and trauma that the accident had caused, but it also expressed gratitude for the opportunity it had provided for healing and redemption. The elderly veteran admitted that the accident had forced him to confront issues he had been avoiding for decades, and that the process of recovery had ultimately made him stronger. Marcus also spoke at the ceremony, thanking Harold and David for their forgiveness and promising to continue serving the veteran community for the rest of his life. The young man announced that he was enrolling in community college courses in social work, with the goal of eventually becoming a counselor who could help other people who had made serious mistakes. Marcus had found his calling in service to others, particularly veterans who struggled with trauma and isolation. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of a plaque honoring Harold's military service and his courage in choosing forgiveness over revenge. The plaque would be permanently displayed at the VFW chapter, where Marcus would see it every day as he continued his community service. The memorial would serve as a reminder of the power of redemption and the importance of second chances. Over the following years, the relationship between the Patterson family and Marcus Rodriguez continued to evolve. Marcus completed his college degree while serving his sentence, and he eventually became a licensed social worker, specializing in veteran services. He never missed a weekend of jail time and completed his community service hours ahead of schedule, but more importantly, he never stopped volunteering at the VFW chapter, even after his legal obligations were fulfilled. Harold Patterson's recovery was slower, but ultimately more complete than doctors had initially predicted. Working with VA counselors and spending time with other veterans at the VFW chapter helped him process his wartime trauma and reconnect with his community. The elderly veteran became a mentor to Marcus and other young people who were struggling with difficult circumstances, sharing his wisdom and experience in ways that honored his military service. David Patterson received commendation from his superiors for his handling of the family crisis and his demonstration of military values in civilian circumstances. His decision to choose rehabilitation over revenge became a case study in military leadership programs, illustrating how true strength sometimes meant showing restraint and compassion rather than overwhelming force. The accident that had brought Harold Patterson and Marcus Rodriguez together had caused tremendous pain and trauma that would never be completely erased. But it had also created an opportunity for healing, forgiveness, and redemption that transformed the lives of everyone involved. The story became a powerful example of how tragedy could be transformed into something positive through courage, compassion, and commitment to serving others. Years later, when people in Cedar Falls spoke about the motorcycle accident, they remembered it not as a senseless tragedy, but as a turning point that had brought their community together and demonstrated the power of military values like honor, duty, and service to others. Harold Patterson's choice to forgive Marcus Rodriguez had honored his military service more than any medal or commendation ever could, proving that true heroism sometimes meant choosing healing over revenge.